The morning sun hadn't yet cleared the jagged peaks of Falcon Ridge when Captain Rachel Hayes stepped onto the tarmac at Meridian Air Base. The heat shimmer was already dancing above the concrete, promising another scorching day in the Nevada desert. F-35 Lightning jets gleamed like polished daggers in their hangar bays, fuel trucks hissing as ground crews prepared for the day's operations. Rachel moved with deliberate steps toward Hangar 4, her helmet cradled in one arm, flight gloves neatly looped through her belt. Her boots made barely a whisper against the concrete. After 3 years stationed at Meridian, she had learned to navigate the base like a ghost present, but unnoticed, competent but unremarkable. Her call sign was Sunday, earned during an advanced training exercise when she had threaded a flight path through enemy radar, so precisely that she bypassed their detection grid by exactly 100 seconds. Back then, it had been a compliment. Lately, the other pilots used it with smirks and barely concealed eye rolls. Inside the briefing room, the familiar chaos of morning preparations unfolded. Lieutenant Marcus Webb bumped into her shoulder as he adjusted his headset, grinning without looking her way. "Flying Sunday again, Sunday?" he quipped, earning chuckles from the other pilots scattered around the room. "She's always flying Sunday," called out Lieutenant Angela Torres from across the room. "Even on Thursday." The room erupted in laughter. Rachel didn't join in. She had heard variations of this joke for months now, each repetition wearing thinner than the last. Instead, she focused on the mission briefing playing on the large screen, a replay of yesterday's sortie, showing her flight path tracing the ridgeline with mathematical precision. Captain Diana Reynolds, their squadron leader, stood with arms crossed, studying the footage. "It's clean," she admitted reluctantly, "but sterile. I wouldn't want that kind of flying on a live mission." Webb scoffed loudly. "It's not even flying. It's like she's got the jet on autopilot with good manners. She probably says please and thank you to every control input," added Lieutenant Jake Morrison, sparking another round of laughter. Rachel's fingers tightened around the small notebook she always carried as was carried. Worn leather journal filled with hand-drawn flight grids, altitude calculations, and timing notes that looked more like sheet music than standard mission logs. She had been perfecting her techniques for years, studying wind patterns and thermal dynamics with the dedication of a scholar. But precision, she was learning, was not what earned respect in a fighter squadron. A newer pilot, Lieutenant David Cooper, fresh from another wing, leaned forward curiously. "Does Sunday always fly like that?" Morrison shook his head dismissively. "She's not flying. She's managing airflow. No instinct, no risk, no fire." He gestured at the screen, where Rachel's aircraft maintained perfect formation. "It's like watching someone conduct an orchestra instead of dogfighting." The criticism stung because it wasn't entirely wrong. Rachel did approach flying differently than her squadron mates, where they relied on aggressive maneuvers and split-second reactions. She calculated trajectories and predicted atmospheric conditions. Where they pushed their aircraft to the limits, she found efficiency in smooth, controlled movements. Her method worked. She had never missed a target, never failed a mission parameter, never caused a safety incident. But it wasn't flashy, and in a world where fighter pilots were expected to embody swagger and audacity, her quiet competence felt almost apologetic. Later that morning, as Rachel performed her pre-flight inspection with meticulous care, she noticed young Lieutenant Kevin Torres struggling with his navigation charts nearby. He had been studying her flight notes for weeks, trying to mimic her timing techniques. Yesterday, he had overshot a canyon approach during a training exercise and clipped a simulated ridge marker. The system had registered it as a fatal crash. The wind data was off, he had complained afterward, but Rachel had noticed the real problem. Kevin was forcing her techniques instead of understanding them. He breathed in artificial rhythm, paused at turns without knowing why, and treated her methods like a checklist rather than a philosophy. Rachel ran her hand along the underside of her aircraft's wing, checking for stress fractures that the automated systems might miss. She had once explained to a crew chief that she timed her throttle adjustments to match the cabin pressurization sequence, synchronizing her pitch changes with the engine's natural rhythm. He had thought she was joking. She wasn't. The operations board above the pilot lockers updated with a soft electronic chime. New sortie assignments appeared in glowing letters. Rachel's name was listed third. Sunday. Target grid 3. Same. Parameters. Another routine patrol mission in the same sector she had flown dozens of times before. Captain Reynolds paused behind her, clipboard in hand. Try something dynamic this time, Hayes. Command wants to see aggressive engagement profiles. In the quarterly reports. Rachel didn't look up from her equipment check. The corridor only allows 3 seconds of climb at that altitude interval. Beyond that, the ridge echo bounces into the threat range. Reynolds raised an eyebrow. And you won't waste seconds, you. Don't need? I don't need seconds I won't use effectively. Reynolds walked away, muttering something about rhythm pilots and flying by committee. Rachel picked up her helmet, noting that the visor wasn't perfectly polished. She preferred it that way less glare meant better focus on the horizon ahead. Her squadron patch was tucked inside the helmet lining rather than displayed prominently, like the others. Sunday, stitched in block letters by hand, a reminder of precision over showmanship. As she walked toward the flight line, she could feel the weight of dismissive glances from her fellow pilots. They saw her measured pace and quiet demeanor as weakness, her careful preparation as excessive caution. But Rachel knew something they didn't. In the air, when split seconds determined success or failure, when weather turned hostile and equipment failed, when the mission demanded absolute precision, that was when her approach revealed its true value. She had spent years learning to fly not just with her hands and eyes, but with her entire being attuned to the subtle rhythms of wind, metal, and sky. The others might joke about her flying like she was in church, but Rachel understood that the cockpit was indeed a sacred space. Every control input was a prayer, every maneuver a meditation, every successful mission a small miracle of coordination between human intuition and mechanical precision. As she climbed into her aircraft and began the startup sequence, Rachel felt the familiar calm settling over her. The engine spooled up in its characteristic rhythm, the canopy sealed with a soft hiss, and the horizon ahead beckoned with infinite possibility. Let the others chase glory through spectacular aerobatics. She would find her victories in the quiet spaces between heartbeats, in the perfect timing that turned ordinary flight into something approaching art. The tower cleared her for takeoff, and Rachel Hayes' call sign. Sunday rolled toward the runway with the same deliberate precision that had defined her entire career. Above the desert, the sky waited, vast and demanding, ready to reward those who approached it with proper respect. The emergency briefing tent buzzed with nervous energy as pilots and ground crew gathered around the tactical display. The canvas walls fluttered in the desert wind, and the battery-powered LED lights cast harsh shadows across the maps spread over the planning table. Rachel stood near the back, her notebook pressed against her chest, listening as Captain Reynolds outlined the crisis. "We've lost contact with Reconnaissance Team Bravo," Reynolds announced, her voice cutting through the murmur of concerned voices. 5 operators deployed to observation posts in the Coutura Basin. Last communication was 18 hours ago. The overhead display showed a topographical map marked with red zones and question marks. The basin lay nestled between jagged peaks, a geographic maze of thermal updrafts and electromagnetic interference that made both satellite communication and drone surveillance nearly impossible. "Weather window is closing fast," Reynolds continued. We've got maybe 4 hours before the storm system makes the entire region unflyable. Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." Lieutenant Webb leaned forward, studying the map with the confidence of someone who had never met a problem he couldn't solve with raw aggression. "If we go in fast and loud, we can sweep the primary coordinates. Hit the LZ hard, make visual contact, and extract before the weather hits." Several pilots nodded in agreement. It was the kind of bold, straightforward approach that had made Webb the squadron's unofficial leader, at least in terms of who got the most attention during briefings. "What about the terrain challenges?" asked Lieutenant Morrison. "Those ridges are going to create serious wind shear, and the thermal blooms will mess with our instruments." "We punch through," Webb replied with a shrug. "Speed solves most problems. If we're fast enough, the weather won't matter." Rachel felt a familiar tightness in her chest as she listened to the discussion. She had been studying the Coutura Basin for months, fascinated by its unique atmospheric conditions. Her notebook contained detailed charts of the region's thermal patterns, wind corridors, and the narrow flight paths that could potentially thread through the interference zones. "There's another option," she said quietly, her voice barely audible above the discussion. The tent fell silent. All eyes turned to her, some curious, others annoyed at the interruption. "There's a thermal corridor." Along the north slope, Rachel continued, opening her notebook to a hand-drawn map covered in precise annotations. 32 seconds between radar echoes. It's thermally unstable for satellite communication, but navigable under visual conditions. Webb let out a dismissive laugh. "Sunday's bringing scripture again." Rachel ignored the comment, her finger tracing a route on her map. "If we enter at 73 knots with a left roll at Mach 2, the terrain folds allow a climb and pivot with zero radar signature bleed." "And what's the margin for error?" Webb asked, his tone suggesting he already knew he wouldn't like the answer. 81 seconds total flight time through the corridor. If you miss the turn by more than 3 seconds, the heat bloom creates a sensor trap. Webb whistled mockingly. "Sounds like a metronome drill, not a rescue mission." The other pilots chuckled, but Rachel noticed that Captain Reynolds was studying her map with genuine interest. For a moment, she felt a spark of hope that someone might actually consider her approach. "That's one option," Reynolds said finally. "What else do we have?" Lieutenant Torres stepped forward, a voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned respect through conventional channels. "We going straight and fast. Thermal instability won't matter if we're moving at maximum velocity. Hit the coordinates hard, sweep for visuals, and extract before the weather deteriorates further." Reynolds nodded approvingly. "All right." Torres takes point on the primary mission. Webb flies wing support. Hayes ... double quotes. Glancing at Rachel's map one more time. "Hayes, you prep contingency logistics. Monitor communications and be ready for backup procedures." Rachel felt the familiar sting of being relegated to support roles, but she simply nodded and closed her notebook. She had grown accustomed to being the insurance policy rather than the primary plan. The mission launched 28 minutes later. Rachel watched from the observation deck as Torres and Webb's aircraft screamed across the desert toward the mountains, their contrails cutting brilliant white lines against the blue sky. She had packed secondary medical supplies and laid out emergency recovery equipment with the same methodical precision she brought to everything else. 53 minutes after launch, both aircraft returned ahead of schedule. No contact with the reconnaissance team, severe visibility issues, dangerous crosswinds, and partial sensor blackout had forced them to abort the mission before reaching the primary search area. Back in the briefing tent, the mood was considerably more subdued. The weather satellite showed storm clouds building rapidly over the basin, and the communication blackout remained total. 5 operators were still missing, and the rescue window was shrinking by the hour. "We need another approach," Reynolds said, her frustration evident. "Something that doesn't rely on brute force." Rachel opened her notebook again, her fingers finding the detailed corridor map she had spent months perfecting. The route was there, viable and waiting, but she had learned not to volunteer too enthusiastically. Instead, she waited. "What about Sunday's metronome route?" asked Lieutenant Cooper, the newest pilot. "Maybe the stealth approach makes more sense if the direct assault isn't working." Webb shook his head immediately. "That's not flying, that's accounting. You can't navigate a combat zone by counting seconds." "But she's never missed a target," Cooper pointed out. "Maybe precision is exactly what we need right now." The tent fell silent again. Rachel could feel the weight of skeptical gazes, the unspoken question hanging in the air. Could someone who flew like she was conducting a symphony really handle a life-or-death rescue mission? Reynolds studied the weather display, her jaw tight. With the pressure of command decisions, the storm's moving faster than predicted. "We've got maybe 2 hours before the entire region becomes completely impassable." Rachel felt her heart rate increase. She knew her corridor route could work, but she also knew that suggesting it again would likely be seen as pushy or arrogant. The fine line between confidence and presumption had always been difficult for her to navigate. "Ma'am," she said carefully, "the thermal corridor remains viable even in deteriorating weather conditions. The approach angle actually uses the storm's pressure differentials to maintain stability." "Theoretical stability," Webb interjected, "based on calculations, not real-world experience." "All flying is theoretical until you do it," Rachel replied quietly. "Every maneuver starts as mathematics before it becomes instinct." Reynolds looked at her for a long moment, then at the map, then at the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. "We'll keep it as a backup option," she said finally. "For now, we wait for the weather to clear and try the direct approach again." Rachel nodded, but inside she felt the familiar frustration of being perpetually kept in reserve. She understood the logic. Her flying style didn't inspire confidence in high-stress situations. But she also understood something her squadron mates didn't. Sometimes, the situations that looked impossible were actually the ones that demanded the most precise, calculated approach. As the briefing broke up and pilots dispersed to their various duties, Rachel remained behind, studying her notebook in the dim light of the tent. The thermal corridor was still there, still viable, still waiting for someone brave enough to trust in precision over power. Outside, the first drops of rain began to fall, and thunder rolled across the mountains like a distant artillery barrage. Somewhere in those peaks, 5 operators were waiting for rescue, and Rachel Hayes' call sign Sunday was waiting for her chance to prove that sometimes the quiet approach was exactly what the mission required. The storm hit Meridian Air Base just after midnight, turning the desert into a chaos of wind and lightning. Rachel lay awake in her bunk, listening to the rain hammer against the barracks windows while her mind raced through calculations. The thermal corridor would be even more viable now. The storm's pressure systems, creating the exact atmospheric conditions her route was designed to exploit. But she wasn't on the mission roster. Again. The emergency briefing at 0600 was smaller this time, just the essential personnel and flight crew. The missing reconnaissance team had been out of contact for 36 hours now, and the weather satellites showed only a brief window of flyable conditions before the next storm system arrived. "We're running out of time," Captain Reynolds announced grimly. "The search area is compromised. Communications are still down, and we've got maybe 3 hours of marginal flying weather." Rachel entered the briefing room quietly, carrying her notebook and a thermos of coffee. She had spent the night refining her corridor calculations, accounting for the storm's impact on wind patterns and thermal dynamics. The mathematics were elegant, the route was viable, but she knew better than to volunteer too eagerly. Lieutenant Webb was already holding court at the front of the room, pointing at the tactical display with characteristic confidence. We modify. The direct approach. Go in lower. Use the storm cover to mask our approach and sweep the coordinates in a grid pattern. The visibility is going to be terrible, pointed out Lieutenant Torres. And those wind shears will be even worse now. Webb waved off her concerns. We've flown in worse weather. Speed and determination will get us through. Rachel watched the discussion with growing frustration. They were still thinking in terms of overwhelming force, still trying to muscle their way through a problem that required finesse. She opened her notebook, double-checking her calculations one more time. The numbers were solid. The route was sound, but she had learned that being right wasn't enough if you couldn't make people listen. What about the thermal corridor approach? Asked Lieutenant Cooper, glancing toward Rachel. Given the storm conditions, maybe the stealth route makes more sense now. Sunday Symphony Orchestra approach? Webb laughed. You want to trust a rescue mission to someone who flies like she's afraid to disturb the air? The comment hit harder than usual, carrying an edge of cruelty that made Rachel's cheeks burn. She had dealt with dismissive comments for years, but this felt different, more personal, more pointed. I'm not afraid of the air, she said quietly. I'm respectful of it. There's a difference. Is there? Webb turned to face her directly. Because from where I sit, it looks like you're playing it safe while real pilots take real risks. Rachel felt something snap inside her chest. The months of condescension, the years of being treated as an afterthought, the constant relegation. To back up roles, it all crystallized into a moment of perfect clarity. Real pilots don't crash into mountains because they're too proud to calculate wind shear, she replied, her voice still quiet but carrying a steel edge that made several people in the room look up in surprise. Webb's face darkened. Are you suggesting that I can't handle adverse weather conditions? I'm suggesting that confidence without precision is just recklessness with better marketing. The room fell silent. Rachel could feel her heart pounding, but she didn't back down. For once, she was going to speak her mind completely. The thermal corridor isn't a theory, she continued, opening her notebook to show the detailed calculations. It's a mathematical certainty. The storm system creates pressure differentials that actually stabilize the flight path. Entry at 73 knots, left roll at marker 2. Maintain altitude through the thermal layers, and emerge at the basin, coordinates with 0 radar signature and minimal weather interference. Captain Reynolds studied the map with genuine interest. What's your confidence level on this approach? 100%. Rachel replied without hesitation. I've flown similar corridors in simulation dozens of times. The physics are sound, the mathematics are verified, and the atmospheric conditions are optimal right now. Webb scoffed. Simulation isn't reality, Sunday. And when those operators are depending on us for extraction, we can't afford to trust our lives to your bedtime calculations. Those operators are counting on us to reach them, Rachel shot back. And the direct approach has already failed twice. Maybe it's time to try something that actually works instead of something that just looks impressive. The tension in the room was palpable. Rachel had never spoken so directly to her fellow pilots, never challenged their methods so openly. But she was tired of being dismissed, tired of watching viable solutions ignored because they didn't fit the traditional fighter pilot image. Reynolds looked at the weather display, then at the mission timeline, then at Rachel's detailed corridor map. Hayes, I appreciate your ..ness, but this is a rescue mission, not a precision flying exhibition. We need someone who can adapt to changing conditions, not someone who needs everything to go exactly according to plan. My plans account for changing conditions, Rachel said. That's why they work. Your plans account for perfect execution. Webb interjected. What happens when real-world variables don't match your notebook? Rachel felt the familiar frustration of being caught between confidence and humility. If she insisted too strongly on her approach, she would be seen as arrogant. If she didn't advocate for it, she would be ignored entirely. Real-world variables. Why I study atmospheric dynamics, she said finally. I don't just hope for good conditions. I understand how to work with whatever conditions exist. Reynolds made her decision. Webb takes the modified direct approach. Torres flies support. Hayes, you monitor communications and coordinate with base operations. Rachel nodded, closing her notebook with hands that trembled slightly from suppressed emotion. Another mission, another relegation to the sidelines. She had laid out a viable solution, defended it with mathematics and logic, and still been dismissed in favor of the same approach that had already failed. As the briefing broke up and pilots headed to their aircraft, Rachel remained in her chair, staring at the storm tracking display. The weather window was narrowing, the missing operators were running out of time, and the squadron was about to repeat the same mistakes that had already cost them precious hours. Lieutenant Cooper approached her as she gathered her materials. For what it's worth, I think your approach makes sense. Thanks, Rachel replied quietly. But making sense isn't enough around here. Maybe not, Cooper said. But being right usually wins in the end. Rachel watched through the rain-streaked windows as Webb and Torres prepped their aircraft for launch. Their confidence was admirable, their dedication unquestionable, but their approach was fundamentally flawed. The storm would defeat them just as surely as it had defeated the previous attempts. She picked up her notebook, its pages filled with calculations that might save lives if anyone would listen to them. The thermal corridor was still there, still viable, still waiting for someone brave enough to trust in precision over bravado. Outside, lightning split the sky, and the wind howled across the desert like a promise of things to come. Rachel Hayes' call, signed Sunday, was beginning to realize that sometimes you had to stop waiting for permission to do what you knew was right. The second mission failed even more spectacularly than the first. Webb and Torres returned after 47 minutes, their aircraft battered by wind shear and their instruments scrambled by electromagnetic interference. They had managed to penetrate the storm system, but couldn't maintain stable flight patterns in the basin's chaotic, atmospheric conditions. It's like flying through a washing machine, Torres reported during the hasty debriefing. The wind patterns are completely unpredictable, and the thermal blooms are playing havoc with our navigation systems. Webb's confidence had taken a visible hit. His usual swagger was replaced by frustration as he described the harrowing flight. We need better weather conditions or different equipment. The current approach just isn't viable in these conditions. Rachel sat in the back of the briefing. Rachel sat in the room, her notebook open to a fresh page of calculations. She had been refining her thermal corridor route throughout the morning, incorporating real-time weather data and adjusting for the storm's evolving patterns. The mathematics were more complex now, but the fundamental principle remained sound. Work with the atmosphere instead of fighting against it. Captain Reynolds looked exhausted as she studied the weather projections. The next storm system hits in 6 hours. After that, we're looking at 48 hours of complete weather blackout. If we don't reach that reconnaissance team soon. She didn't need to finish the sentence. Everyone understood the implications. 5 operators had been missing for almost 2 days now, and their survival prospects decreased with every passing hour. Ma'am, Rachel said quietly, I'd like to review the thermal corridor approach one more time. The room fell silent. After 2 failed missions, her suggestion carried more weight than it had that morning, but she could still feel the skepticism in the air. Hayes, Reynolds said carefully, I appreciate your persistence, but we need a proven approach, not an Experimental one. The direct approach has failed twice, Rachel replied, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. At what point do we consider that the experimental approach might actually be the proven one? Webb started to object, but Lieutenant Cooper spoke up first. She's got a point. Maybe it's time to try something different. Different doesn't mean better, Webb argued. Sunday's approach requires perfect conditions and perfect execution. One mistake and you're dead. The current approach requires impossible conditions and miraculous execution, Rachel countered. And it's already failed twice. She opened her notebook to show the updated calculations. The thermal corridor actually becomes more stable during storm conditions. The pressure differentials create a natural flight path through the interference zones. It's counterintuitive, but it's mathematically sound. Reynolds studied the map with renewed interest. Walk me through it. Rachel stood and approached the tactical display, her confidence growing as she moved into familiar territory. The storm system creates a pressure gradient along the north slope. If we enter at precisely 73 knots and maintain a specific altitude profile, we can ride the thermal layers like a highway through the mountains. She traced the route with her finger, showing how the flight path wound through the peaks. Using natural atmospheric phenomena rather than fighting against them. The key is timing, she continued. Each maneuver has to be executed within a narrow window, but the windows are predictable. 32 seconds between radar echoes, 81 seconds total flight time through the corridor, and a 3-second margin for the final approach. What if the calculations are wrong? Torres asked. What if the atmospheric conditions change during the flight? Rachel had anticipated this question. I've been monitoring the storm system for the past 6 hours. The pressure patterns are stable and predictable. The thermal layers are actually strengthening, which makes the corridor more viable, not less. She pulled out a second notebook, filled with real-time weather data and atmospheric modeling. I've been tracking barometric pressure, wind speed, thermal gradients, and electromagnetic interference patterns. The conditions are as close to optimal as we're likely to get. Webb shook his head. You're asking us to trust our lives to a bunch of numbers in a notebook. I'm asking you to trust physics, Rachel replied. The same physics that keep every aircraft in the air. The difference is that I'm working with atmospheric conditions instead of against them. Captain Reynolds looked at the mission timeline, then at the weather projections, then at Rachel's detailed calculations. The weight of command was visible in her posture, the pressure of making decisions that could save or cost lives. How confident are you in this approach? Reynolds asked. Rachel felt the familiar tension between humility and conviction. She had spent years being told that her methods were too cautious, too calculated, too precise. But now, when lives were on the line, those same qualities might be exactly what the mission required. Completely confident, she said. I've run the calculations dozens of times, modeled the atmospheric conditions, and verified the flight path. It will work. And if it doesn't, then we'll know we tried something that had a chance of succeeding instead of repeating something that had already failed. The room was quiet, except for the sound of rain against the windows and the distant rumble of thunder. Rachel could feel the weight of skeptical gazes, but she also sensed something she hadn't felt before. Genuine consideration of her approach. Lieutenant Cooper spoke up again. I volunteer to fly with her. If somebody's willing to stake her career on this approach, I'm willing to trust her judgment. Webb looked incredulous. You're going to risk your life on a theory? I'm going to risk my life on mathematics, Cooper replied, which seems more reliable than hoping the weather will magically improve. Rachel felt a surge of gratitude toward Cooper, but she also realized that she didn't want to risk someone else's life on her calculations. If the thermal corridor approach was going to be tested, she wanted to be the one taking the risk. "I'll fly it solo," she said. "The corridor is narrow enough that a single aircraft is actually optimal. Less turbulence, more precise navigation, and lower risk of detection." Reynolds studied her for a long moment. "Hayes, this isn't a training exercise. If something goes wrong out there, you're on your own. I understand, ma'am. But those operators are running out of time, and this approach gives us the best chance of reaching them." The captain looked at the weather display one more time, then at the mission timeline, then at Rachel's confident expression. The decision was clearly difficult, weighing Rachel's unconventional approach against the traditional methods that had already failed. "All right," Reynolds said finally. "You get one chance. But Hayes, if this doesn't work, if you can't reach the reconnaissance team, or if you get into trouble out there, we won't be able to help you. The weather window is too narrow for a second attempt." Rachel nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. She was being given the opportunity she had wanted, but it came with the full weight of responsibility. 5 lives depended on her calculations, her precision, and her ability to execute a flight plan that no one else believed in. "I won't need a second attempt," she said quietly. "The thermal corridor will work." As the briefing broke up and pilots began preparing for the mission, Rachel remained behind, making final adjustments to her calculations. The storm was intensifying outside, creating the exact atmospheric conditions her route was designed to exploit. For the first time in her career, the weather that everyone else saw as an obstacle was actually her greatest advantage. She closed her notebook, picked up her helmet, and headed toward the flight line. The thermal corridor was waiting, mathematically perfect and physically sound. All she had to do was trust her calculations and fly with the precision that had defined her entire career. The missing operators were counting on her, and Rachel Hayes' call sign, Sunday, was finally ready to prove that sometimes the quiet approach was exactly what the mission required. The pre-flight inspection took Rachel longer than usual, not because she was being more careful, but because she was savoring the moment. For the first time in 3 years, she was preparing for a mission that would be flown entirely according to her own specifications. No compromises, no committee decisions, no second-guessing from squadron mates who didn't understand her methods. The storm had intensified during the past hour, turning the sky a deep gray-green that spoke of serious weather ahead. Most pilots would see the conditions as prohibitive, but Rachel saw them as optimal. The atmospheric pressure differentials that were making conventional flight nearly impossible were the same forces that would stabilize her thermal corridor route. She ran her hand along the wing of her F-35, feeling for microscopic stress fractures that automated systems might miss. The aircraft was in perfect condition, its systems calibrated to her precise specifications. She had spent the morning adjusting seat height, instrument positioning, and control sensitivity to match her exact requirements. Her notebook was secured in the cockpit, open to the thermal corridor calculations. The numbers were burned into her memory, but she wanted them visible as backup. Every second counted, every degree of angle mattered, and there was no room for approximation. "Captain." Reynolds appeared at the bottom of the aircraft ladder as Rachel completed her final checks. "Last chance to reconsider, Hayes. The weather is getting worse, and you'll be completely on your own out there." "I understand, ma'am," Rachel replied, adjusting her helmet strap. "But the storm conditions are actually improving the corridor stability. The pressure gradients are exactly what the calculations predicted." Reynolds studied the threatening sky. "Your confidence is either admirable or terrifying. I'm not sure which." "Both, probably," Rachel said with a slight smile. "But confidence, based on mathematics, is still mathematics." As she climbed into the cockpit, Rachel felt the familiar calm settling over her. This was where she belonged, where her precision and calculation transformed from personality quirks into mission-critical skills. The engine spooled up with its characteristic whine, and she began the startup sequence with practiced efficiency. The control tower cleared her for takeoff with obvious reluctance. The weather conditions were marginal at best, and she was flying a route that existed only in her notebook. But the mission was approved, the aircraft was ready, and the thermal corridor was waiting. Rachel taxied toward the runway with deliberate precision, her movement smooth and controlled despite the crosswinds buffeting the aircraft. As she reached the takeoff position, she took a deep breath and opened her notebook one final time. The calculations were perfect, the conditions were optimal, and the missing reconnaissance team was counting on her. "Meridian Tower, this is Sunday," she said into her radio. "Requesting clearance for thermal corridor approach to Coutura Basin. Sunday, you are cleared for takeoff. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Recommend abort if visibility drops below minimums." "Understood, Tower. Sunday is rolling." The F-35 accelerated down the runway with smooth power, lifting off into the storm-darkened sky. Rachel climbed quickly to her predetermined altitude, then leveled off and began the approach to the thermal corridor. The visibility was poor, but she had expected that. Her route didn't depend on visual navigation. It depended on atmospheric dynamics and precise timing. The first thermal layer appeared exactly where her calculations had predicted it would. Rachel adjusted her angle of attack by 2 degrees and felt the aircraft settle into the invisible highway of heated air. The ride became smoother immediately, the buffeting winds replaced by steady, predictable lift. She began counting in her head, matching her breathing to the rhythm of the flight. 1001, 1002, 1003. At precisely 1032, she initiated the first turn, rolling left at exactly the angle her calculations specified. The mountains loomed ahead, their peaks shrouded in storm clouds. To any other pilot, they would represent an impenetrable barrier. To Rachel, they were simply another variable in the equation, their thermal signatures as predictable as the laws of physics that govern them. The radar warning receiver remained silent. Just as she had calculated, the thermal corridor was masking her aircraft signature, making her invisible to conventional detection systems. She was flying through one of the most heavily monitored airspaces in the region, but the atmosphere itself was hiding her. At marker 2, she initiated the second turn, rolling right this time while maintaining exact altitude. The thermal layers were stronger here, the heated air rising from the sun-baked mountain slopes, creating columns of lift that her aircraft rode like an invisible elevator. The storm was actually helping her, its pressure systems creating the exact atmospheric conditions her route required. Rain pelted her canopy, but the thermal layers beneath her remained stable and predictable. She was flying in harmony with the weather instead of fighting against it. 37 minutes after takeoff, Rachel reached the edge of the Coutura Basin. The terrain below was a maze of rocky outcroppings and dense vegetation, perfect for hiding a reconnaissance team, but terrible for conventional search patterns. She began the final phase of her approach, using the thermal dynamics to maintain stable flight while scanning for signs of the missing operators. Her radio crackled with static as she entered the basin's electromagnetic interference zone. Communication with base was impossible now, but she had expected that. The thermal corridor approach was designed to operate independently of external support. She flew a careful search pattern, using the natural thermal currents to maintain altitude while conserving fuel. The missing reconnaissance team would be hiding in the most inaccessible location possible, somewhere that offered both concealment and defensive positions. Then, she saw a brief flash of light from a rocky outcropping near the center of the basin. Not sunlight reflecting off metal, but the deliberate pulse of a signal mirror. 3 short flashes, pause, 3 long flashes, pause, 3 short flashes. SOS in Morse code. Rachel adjusted her flight path, using the thermal currents to spiral down toward the source of the signal. The terrain below was treacherous, a jumble of boulders and narrow ravines that would make any conventional landing impossible. But she wasn't planning a conventional approach. Her radio burst to life with static-filled voices as she descended below the interference zone. Unknown aircraft, this is Reconnaissance Team Bravo. Identify yourself. Team Bravo, this is Captain Hayes. Call sign Sunday. I'm here to get you out. A pause then. Sunday? We were expecting a full extraction team. I am the extraction team, Rachel replied, her voice calm despite the complexity of the maneuver she was about to attempt. Prepare for immediate evacuation. Weather window is closing fast. She could see the team now, 5 figures clustered behind a natural rock formation that provided cover from multiple directions. One was clearly wounded, supported by 2 others. They had chosen their hiding spot well invisible from ground. Approach and protected from aerial surveillance, but also nearly inaccessible for rescue. Rachel began the most challenging part of her mission, using the thermal corridor principles to create a stable hover position in impossible terrain. She reduced power gradually, letting the heated air rising from the rocks provide lift while she maneuvered into position. The aircraft settled into a precarious balance, held aloft by atmospheric dynamics rather than engine thrust. "How are you doing that?" came a voice over the radio, filled with professional amazement. "Physics," Rachel replied simply, maintaining perfect control despite the swirling winds and unpredictable thermals. "Prepare for cable extraction. You have 2 minutes before the weather deteriorates further." The extraction proceeded with mechanical precision. Using her aircraft's emergency winch system, Rachel lifted each team member individually, timing each ascent to match the thermal cycle she had calculated. The wounded operator required extra care, but her stable hover position made the delicate maneuver possible. As the last team member was secured, Rachel felt the thermal layers beginning to weaken. The storm was intensifying, and her window of atmospheric stability was closing. She increased power gradually, using the remaining thermal lift to gain altitude while transitioning back to conventional flight. "All personnel secure," reported the team leader. "Ready for extraction." Rachel began the return journey, following her thermal corridor in reverse. The route that had brought her safely into the basin would now carry her home, the mathematical precision of her approach proving its value under the most demanding conditions possible. The flight back to Meridian Air Base was a masterpiece of atmospheric navigation. Rachel rode the thermal layers with perfect timing, her aircraft dancing through the storm clouds like it was choreographed to match the weather patterns. She emerged from the mountain range just as the worst of the storm system arrived, having threaded the needle of opportunity with mathematical precision. The control tower cleared her for immediate landing, their voices carrying a mixture of relief and amazement. "Sunday, how did you maintain stable flight in those conditions?" "I didn't fight the weather," Rachel replied as she lined up for final approach. "I worked with it." The landing was as smooth as her departure had been, the aircraft touching down with barely a whisper despite the crosswinds. As she taxied toward the hangar, Rachel could see ground crews and pilots gathering to witness her return. Word of her successful mission had already spread through the base. Captain Reynolds was waiting at the bottom of the aircraft ladder as Rachel shut down the engines. "Outstanding work, Hayes. How did you know the thermal corridor would hold in those conditions?" Rachel climbed down from the cockpit, her notebook tucked under her arm and a quiet satisfaction in her eyes. "I didn't know, ma'am. I calculated it." "There's a difference." The reconnaissance team was already being escorted to medical evaluation, their safe return a testament to the power of precision over force. Rachel watched them go, knowing that her mathematical approach had succeeded where conventional tactics had failed. Lieutenant Webb approached her as she completed her post-flight documentation. His usual swagger was replaced by genuine respect. "I owe you an apology, Sunday. I was wrong about your methods." "You weren't wrong about everything," Rachel replied diplomatically. "Aggressive tactics have their place, but sometimes the situation calls for a different approach." As the excitement of the successful mission began to settle, Rachel realized that something fundamental had changed. She was no longer the squadron's cautious backup pilot, the one who flew by committee and calculated every risk. She had proven that precision and mathematics could accomplish what raw aggression could not. Her call sign Sunday had originally been a compliment that turned into a mockery, but now it meant something different entirely. She had earned it through excellence, and she had redeemed it through courage. The quiet pilot who calculated wind patterns and timed her maneuvers to atmospheric rhythms had just pulled off the most challenging rescue mission in the squadron's recent history. The storm continued to rage outside, but inside the hangar, the atmosphere had shifted permanently. Rachel Hayes was no longer an outsider looking in. She was a pilot whose methods had been proven under the most demanding conditions possible. The debriefing room was packed beyond capacity. Word of Rachel's successful rescue mission had spread throughout Meridian Air Base, drawing pilots, ground crew, and command staff who wanted to hear firsthand how she had accomplished what two previous missions had failed to achieve. The tactical display showed her flight path in glowing detail, a serpentine route through the mountains that defied conventional wisdom. The thermal corridor approach utilized natural atmospheric dynamics to maintain stable flight in conditions that would normally be prohibitive, Rachel explained, her voice steady despite the unprecedented attention. By working with the storm system rather than against it, we were able to achieve both stealth and stability. Colonel Harrison, the base commander, leaned forward with obvious interest. "Hayes, this is remarkable flying. How long have you been developing this technique?" "Approximately 3 years, sir. I've been studying atmospheric dynamics and thermal patterns as a way to improve fuel efficiency and reduce radar signatures." "And nobody thought to implement these methods more broadly?" Harrison's question carried an edge of criticism directed toward the squadron leadership. Captain Reynolds shifted uncomfortably. "Colonel, Hayes's approach is highly specialized and requires extensive atmospheric knowledge. It's not easily standardized for general use." Rachel sensed the tension in the room. Her success was creating ripple effects beyond just the successful mission. The thermal corridor approach raised questions about training methods, mission planning, and the squadron's general emphasis on aggressive tactics over technical precision. Lieutenant Webb spoke up from the back of the room. "Sir, with respect, Sunday's method worked this time, but it's extremely dependent on specific conditions. It's not something you can rely on for regular operations. Unlike the direct approach, which has now failed twice under similar conditions," Colonel Harrison's response was pointed. The room fell silent. Rachel felt caught between vindication and discomfort. She had wanted recognition for her methods, but not at the expense of her fellow pilots' reputations. "Colonel," she said carefully, "different missions require different approaches. The thermal corridor technique is effective under specific atmospheric conditions, but is not a replacement for conventional tactics. It's an additional tool in the toolkit." Harrison nodded approvingly. "That's exactly the kind of tactical flexibility we need to encourage. Hayes, I want you to develop a training program based on your atmospheric navigation techniques. We'll implement it as an advanced specialty course." Rachel felt a surge of excitement mixed with apprehension. The opportunity to share her knowledge was everything she had hoped for, but she could already sense the resistance building among her peers. After the debriefing, the responses were mixed. Lieutenant Cooper approached her with genuine enthusiasm. "This is incredible, Rachel. You've just revolutionized how we think about navigation in adverse conditions." But not everyone was supportive. As she walked toward the pilot lounge, she overheard Lieutenant Torres talking to a group of younger pilots. "Don't get too excited about Sunday's magic trick. It's a one-time solution to a specific problem, not a new way of flying." Webb was more direct when he cornered her near the flight simulator bay. "You realize what you've done, don't you? Command is going to want everyone to fly like calculators now. They're going to turn combat aviation into an engineering exercise." "That's not what I'm suggesting," Rachel replied. "I'm suggesting that understanding atmospheric dynamics makes us better pilots, not that calculation should replace instinct. Tell that to Colonel Harrison. He's already talking about mandatory atmospheric training and precision navigation requirements. You've given the desk jockeys ammunition to micromanage how we fly." Rachel felt the familiar weight of unintended consequences. She had succeeded in proving her methods, but that success was creating new problems. The balance between innovation and tradition, between individual excellence and squadron cohesion, was more delicate than she had realized. The situation became more complicated over the following days. Colonel Harrison scheduled a series of meetings with Rachel to discuss the implementation of atmospheric navigation training. The sessions were productive but time-consuming, taking her away from regular flight duties and creating resentment among pilots who felt she was receiving preferential treatment. "Some days become Command's pet project," she heard Morrison mutter during a briefing. "Next thing you know, they'll be requiring us to submit mathematical proofs before every takeoff." Captain Reynolds called her into a private meeting 3 days after the rescue mission. The squadron leader looked tired and stressed, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible frustration. "Hayes, we need to talk about your new role here. Command is very excited about your atmospheric navigation techniques, but it's creating problems within the squadron." Rachel had been expecting this conversation. "Ma'am, I never intended to disrupt squadron operations. I just wanted to contribute to mission success." "I understand that, and your contribution was outstanding. But now we have pilots questioning established training methods, arguing about the value of aggressive versus precision flying, and requesting transfers to other squadrons because they don't want to be part of an experimental unit." The weight of responsibility settled heavily on Rachel's shoulders. Her success had come at a cost she hadn't anticipated. The cohesion and morale of her squadron were suffering because of the attention her methods had received. "What do you want me to do?" she asked. Reynolds sighed. "I need you to find a way to balance your innovations with squadron unity. Command wants your training program, but I need pilots who can work together effectively. Can you develop something that enhances our capabilities without creating division?" Rachel spent the next several days working on a solution. She studied the personalities and flying styles of her fellow pilots, looking for ways to integrate atmospheric navigation principles without threatening their established methods. The key, she realized, was not to replace their approaches, but to enhance them. She began approaching her squadron mates individually, offering to share specific techniques that could improve their existing flying styles. With Torres, she focused on fuel efficiency calculations that could extend mission range. With Webb, she demonstrated how atmospheric awareness could enhance aggressive maneuvering by predicting air density changes. The individual approach worked better than squadron-wide presentations. Pilots were more receptive to learning new techniques when they could see direct applications to their preferred flying styles. Slowly, the resistance began to diminish as the practical benefits became apparent. Lieutenant Cooper became her most effective advocate, incorporating atmospheric principles into his own flying and demonstrating their value to other pilots. "It's not about flying like Sunday," he explained to a group of skeptical aviators. It's about understanding the environment well enough to use it to your advantage. The breakthrough came during a complex training exercise designed to test the squadron's adaptability under challenging conditions. Rachel found herself flying alongside Webb in a scenario that required both aggressive maneuvering and precise navigation through simulated adverse weather. Instead of competing approaches, they discovered that combining Webb's aggressive tactics with Rachel's atmospheric awareness created a synergy that neither could achieve alone. Webb's bold maneuvers became more effective when timed to atmospheric conditions, while Rachel's precision flying gained dynamic capability when enhanced with tactical aggression. This is what we should be doing, Webb admitted after the exercise. Not choosing between approaches, but combining them. The collaboration marked a turning point for the squadron, rather than seeing Rachel's methods as a threat to established practices. Pilots began viewing them as an enhancement that could make their existing skills more effective. The atmospheric navigation training program evolved from a replacement for conventional techniques into an advanced specialization that complemented traditional fighter pilot training. Captain Reynolds observed the change with obvious relief. "Ace, you've managed to turn a potential squadron crisis into a significant capability enhancement. Well done." Rachel felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond individual achievement. She had proven that innovation and tradition could coexist, that precision and aggression could work together, and that squadron unity didn't require uniformity of approach. Her call sign Sunday had evolved again, no longer a description of cautious flying, but a recognition of the day she had revolutionized how her squadron thought about the relationship between pilot and atmosphere. She was still the pilot who calculated wind patterns and timed maneuvers to thermal dynamics. But now she was also the pilot who had shown others how to see the sky as an ally rather than an obstacle. 6 months after the Coutura Basin rescue, Rachel found herself facing the most significant challenge of her career. The annual Red Flag exercise at Nellis Air Force Base would pit the best pilots from multiple squadrons against each other in realistic combat scenarios. For the first time, her squadron would be testing their enhanced atmospheric navigation techniques against elite opposition under the most demanding conditions possible. The briefing room at Nellis buzzed with competitive energy as pilots from 6 different squadrons studied the exercise parameters. The scenario was brutally complex. A multi-day campaign involving air-to-air combat, precision strikes, and search and rescue operations across varied terrain and weather conditions. Success would require not just individual skill but seamless integration of different flying styles and tactical approaches. Rachel sat with her Meridian squadron, noting how the dynamics had evolved since the thermal corridor incident. Webb now consulted with her regularly on atmospheric conditions. Torres incorporated fuel efficiency calculations into her mission planning, and the entire unit had developed a reputation for innovative problem-solving. They were no longer just fighter pilots, they were atmospheric tacticians. "The opposition includes some of the best pilots in the Air Force," announced Colonel Davidson, the exercise director. "Squadron leaders from Tyndall, Shaw, and Mountain Home. These are pilots who've been flying longer than some of you have been alive, and they don't give participation trophies at Red Flag." The competitive atmosphere was palpable. Rachel could see pilots from other squadrons sizing up the Meridian team, their expressions ranging from curious to dismissive. The reputation of the calculator pilots had spread throughout the Air Force, generating both interest and skepticism about their unconventional methods. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Kane from Tyndall Air Force Base approached their group during the break. His call sign was Hammer, and his reputation for aggressive flying was legendary throughout the Air Force. "So you're the atmospheric navigation team I've been hearing about. Looking forward to seeing if your math works against real opposition." Webb stepped forward to respond, but Rachel spoke first. We're looking forward to demonstrating the practical applications, sir. Atmospheric dynamics don't change just because the opposition gets more challenging. Kane smiled with the confidence of someone who had never met a problem that couldn't be solved with superior firepower. We'll see about that Sunday. I've been flying combat missions since before you graduated from flight school. Experience trumps equations every time. The exchange was polite but pointed, establishing the competitive framework that would define the exercise. Traditional aggression versus innovative precision. Experience versus analysis. Instinct versus calculation. The red flag exercise would determine which approach proved superior under realistic combat conditions. The first day of the exercise was a revelation. The Meridian Squadron's atmospheric navigation techniques proved devastatingly effective in the complex air-to-air scenarios. Rachel's ability to predict thermal layers and wind patterns allowed her team to position themselves advantageously, appearing where opponents didn't expect them and disappearing when conventional tactics suggested they should be visible. Webb found that combining his aggressive maneuvering with atmospheric awareness gave him an almost unfair advantage. He could push his aircraft harder and longer than opponents expected because he understood how to use air density variations to enhance performance. "It's like having a secret weapon," he radioed to Rachel during one engagement. "I can see opportunities that other pilots miss entirely." But the real test came on day 3, when a simulated emergency scenario required immediate response to a downed pilot in hostile territory. The rescue mission would take place in mountainous terrain during a storm system, conditions that had defeated many previous attempts during red flag exercises. Colonel Kane's team launched first, using traditional direct approach tactics. Their powerful aircraft and aggressive flying were impressive to watch, but the simulated surface-to-air threats and adverse weather conditions forced them to abort after 2 attempts. The electronic warfare systems at Nellis were sophisticated enough to create realistic atmospheric interference that made conventional navigation extremely difficult. "Meridian Squadron, you're cleared for rescue attempt," came the radio call. "Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. This is your only window." Rachel felt the familiar calm settling over her as she reviewed the atmospheric data. The storm system was intense but predictable, creating the same kind of thermal corridors she had used in the Coutura Basin. The difference was that this time, she wasn't flying alone. She had a team that understood her methods and could support them effectively. "Webb, Torres, Cooper form up for thermal corridor approach," she transmitted. "Entry altitude 7,000 feet, 73 knots indicated airspeed. Follow my lead and trust the mathematics." The approach required perfect coordination between 4 aircraft flying in formation through atmospheric conditions that other pilots found unmanageable. Rachel led the formation into the thermal corridor, her squadron mates following her precise timing and altitude changes with the synchronization of a ballet company. The electronic warfare environment at Nellis was more sophisticated than anything they had encountered before. Radar signatures were scrambled, navigation systems provided false readings, and communication systems suffered intermittent failures. But the thermal corridor approach didn't depend on electronic systems. It relied on atmospheric physics that couldn't be jammed or spoofed. They reached the simulated crash site in half the time Kane's team had required for their aborted attempts. The coordination required for the rescue was complex, involving precise timing between multiple aircraft while maintaining formation integrity in turbulent conditions. Rachel's team executed the maneuver flawlessly, their atmospheric navigation training allowing them to maintain stable flight while other pilots struggled with basic control. "Outstanding execution, Meridian Squadron," reported the exercise controllers. "Mission success in minimum time with 0 safety violations. Textbook performance." The debriefing that evening was unlike anything Rachel had experienced before. Instead of dismissive comments about her cautious flying, she found herself fielding serious questions from some of the most experienced pilots in the Air Force. The red flag exercise had provided undeniable proof that atmospheric navigation techniques could enhance rather than replace traditional fighter pilot skills. Colonel Kane approached her after the formal debriefing. His earlier confidence had been replaced by professional respect. "Sunday, I owe you an apology. I came here expecting to prove that experience beats innovation, but your team just demonstrated that the best approach combines both." "Thank you, sir. But the real innovation isn't the atmospheric navigation. It's learning to integrate different strengths into a cohesive approach. My squadron mates make the techniques work by adapting them to their own flying styles." Kane nodded thoughtfully. "That's what makes it so impressive. You didn't just develop a new technique, you developed a new way of thinking about aerial tactics. That's the kind of innovation the Air Force needs." The final day of Red Flag featured a complex scenario that required multiple squadrons to work together against a sophisticated opposition force. Rachel found herself designated as mission commander, leading a mixed formation of pilots from different bases who had varying levels of familiarity with atmospheric navigation principles. The challenge was significant: coordinate aircraft with different capabilities and pilot philosophies, while executing a mission that demanded both precision and aggression. But the exercise had demonstrated that atmospheric awareness enhanced rather than replaced traditional skills, making it possible to integrate different approaches effectively. The mission succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The combined formation used atmospheric navigation to achieve tactical surprise while maintaining the aggressive maneuvering that fighter pilots required for air-to-air combat. The result was a level of tactical flexibility that individual squadrons couldn't achieve alone. "Ladies and gentlemen," announced Colonel Davidson during the final debriefing, "this year's Red Flag exercise has demonstrated the future of air combat tactics. The integration of atmospheric navigation principles with traditional fighter pilot skills represents a significant enhancement in capability." He looked directly at Rachel as he continued. "Captain Hayes, your squadron's performance has been exceptional, but more importantly, you've shown us how innovation can strengthen rather than replace proven methods. The Air Force will be incorporating atmospheric navigation training into the advanced pilot curriculum based on your work here." The applause that followed was genuine and sustained. Rachel felt a profound sense of accomplishment, not just for her personal success, but for what her team had achieved together. They had proven that precision and aggression could work in harmony, that calculation and instinct could enhance each other, and that the quiet pilot who flew by mathematics could lead even the most experienced aviators to new levels of effectiveness. As she walked back to her quarters that evening, Rachel reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. She had started as the squadron's cautious backup pilot, the one who calculated wind patterns while others relied on raw skill. Now she was a recognized innovator whose methods were being adopted throughout the Air Force. Her call sign Sunday had evolved once again, no longer a description of her flying style, but a recognition of the day she had fundamentally changed how fighter pilots thought about their relationship with the atmosphere. She was still the pilot who timed maneuvers to thermal dynamics and calculated atmospheric conditions. But now she was also the leader who had shown others how to transform knowledge into tactical advantage. 2 years later, Captain Rachel Hayes stood before a classroom of young pilots at the Air Force Test Pilot School, her instructor wings gleaming on her flight suit. The atmospheric navigation program she had developed was now part of the standard curriculum, and pilots from around the world came to Meridian Air Base to learn the techniques that had revolutionized modern aviation tactics. Atmospheric navigation isn't about replacing your instincts, she explained to the attentive class. It's about giving your instincts better information to work with. When you understand how air moves, how pressure changes affect lift, and how thermal layers create invisible highways in the sky, you're not just flying, you're conducting a symphony. The classroom held pilots from 6 different countries, all eager to learn the methods that had transformed the calculator pilot into one of the most respected instructors in the Air Force. Rachel's story had become legendary, but not for the reasons she might have expected when she first earned her call sign. Lieutenant Sarah Kim, a recent graduate from the Air Force Academy, raised her hand. Mom, how do you maintain atmospheric awareness during high-stress combat situations? Doesn't all that calculation slow down your reaction time? Rachel smiled, remembering when she had struggled with the same question. The calculations become instinctive with practice. Just like you don't consciously think about every control input when you're flying, you stop consciously calculating atmospheric conditions. You feel them. She pulled up a 3-dimensional display showing thermal patterns over mountainous terrain. Let me show you what I mean. This is the Coutura Basin, where I conducted my first operational atmospheric navigation mission. 2 direct approach attempts had failed because pilots were fighting against these conditions instead of working with them. The display traced her original thermal corridor route, showing how she had used the storm system's pressure differentials to maintain stable flight through seemingly impossible conditions. But more importantly, it showed how her success had inspired an entirely new approach to pilot training. The real breakthrough wasn't the technique itself, Rachel continued. It was learning how to integrate atmospheric awareness with traditional fighter pilot skills. My squadron mates didn't abandon their aggressive flying styles. They enhanced them with better environmental understanding. Major Marcus Webb entered the classroom as a guest speaker, his presence commanding immediate attention. He had been promoted to squadron leader the previous year and had become one of the most effective advocates for atmospheric navigation training. When I first met Captain Hayes, Webb said with a self-deprecating grin, I thought she was too cautious to be an effective fighter pilot. I was wrong about almost everything. Her methods didn't make me more cautious. They made me more effective. He moved to the display controls, showing footage from recent training exercises. Atmospheric navigation allows you to be more aggressive, not less. When you understand how air moves, you can push your aircraft harder and position yourself more advantageously. You're not avoiding risk, you're managing it more intelligently. The class watched footage of current Meridian Squadron operations, where pilots seamlessly integrated precision calculations with aggressive maneuvering. The flying was spectacular, but it was also mathematically informed, each maneuver enhanced by understanding of atmospheric dynamics. After the class, Rachel walked across the base toward the memorial wall where names of fallen aviators were inscribed in black granite. She paused before a new addition, the Coutura Basin Memorial, commemorating the 5 reconnaissance operators whose rescue had validated her atmospheric navigation approach. Lieutenant Colonel Diana Reynolds, now the base commander, joined her. At the memorial, "Penny for your thoughts, Sunday." "Just remembering how it all started," Rachel replied. "I never imagined that one rescue mission would lead to all this," Reynolds smiled. "You changed more than just how we fly, Rachel. You changed how we think about innovation, about integrating different approaches, about the value of precision in a culture that often prizes raw aggression." They walked together toward the flight line, where the latest class of atmospheric navigation students was preparing for their first solo flights using thermal corridor techniques. The sight of young pilots carefully calculating wind patterns and thermal dynamics before takeoff would have seemed strange a few years ago, but now it was standard procedure. "The Air Force is implementing your training program at all major bases," Reynolds continued. "But more importantly, you've shown us that excellence comes in many forms. We needed someone who could prove that quiet competence was just as valuable as loud confidence. Rachel watched as Lieutenant Kim completed her pre-flight calculations and climbed into her aircraft. The young pilot's movements showed the same careful precision that had once marked Rachel as different from her peers. But now those characteristics were recognized as strengths rather than limitations. "I think the most important thing I learned," Rachel said, "was that you don't have to change who you are to be successful. You just have to find the right environment to demonstrate your value." The afternoon training flight was a masterpiece of coordinated precision. 12 aircraft executed complex maneuvers through challenging atmospheric conditions, their pilots using thermal layers and pressure differentials to achieve tactical objectives that would have been impossible with COMVENTION approaches alone. Rachel monitored the exercise from the control tower, her radio calls minimal but precise. Her students had internalized the principles of atmospheric navigation, transforming mathematical concepts into instinctive flying skills. They moved through the sky with the same careful precision she had developed, but with a confidence that came from knowing their methods were proven and respected. "Outstanding performance," she transmitted as the formation completed their final approach. "You're not just flying the aircraft, you're dancing with the atmosphere." That evening, Rachel sat in her quarters, writing the final chapter of her book on atmospheric navigation techniques. The manuscript would become required reading at flight schools around the world, but she hoped its real value would be in showing other pilots that innovation could come from unexpected places. Her call sign Sunday was now inscribed on instructor plaques throughout the Air Force, but it had evolved far beyond its original meaning. It no longer described a pilot who flew cautiously on weekends, but rather someone who had transformed precision into an art form and mathematical calculation into tactical advantage. The phone rang, interrupting her writing. Lieutenant Cooper, now a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base, was calling with news about his latest project. "Rachel, you're not going to believe this. We've been testing atmospheric navigation principles on the new 6th-generation fighter prototypes. The performance improvements are incredible. We're seeing 20% increases in fuel efficiency and 30% improvements in stealth characteristics." Rachel smiled, understanding that her work was continuing to evolve and inspire new innovations. The technique she had developed for one specific mission had become the foundation for an entirely new approach to aviation. "That's wonderful, Kevin. But remember, the technology is just a tool. The real innovation is in how we think about flying." After ending the call, Rachel returned to her writing, crafting words that would help future generations of pilots understand. That excellence could take many forms. Some pilots would always be known for their aggressive maneuvering and split-second reflexes. Others, like her, would find their strength in careful analysis and mathematical precision. But the most successful pilots would be those who learned to integrate both approaches, combining the best of traditional fighter pilot culture with innovative thinking and environmental awareness. They would understand that the sky was not an obstacle to overcome, but a partner to work with, not an enemy to defeat, but an ally to understand. As the sun set over Meridian Air Base, Rachel Hayes' call sign Sunday continued writing her legacy. She had proven that quiet competence could change the world, that precision could triumph over prejudice, and that sometimes the most revolutionary approach was simply to trust in the power of understanding over the illusion of force. Her story had become more than just a tale of personal triumph. It was a reminder that innovation could come from anywhere, that excellence took many forms, and that the courage to trust your convictions could transform not just your own career, but an entire profession. The pilot who had once been dismissed for flying too cautiously had become the instructor whose methods were studied around the world. The woman who calculated wind patterns while others relied on instinct had proven that Mathematics and intuition could work together to achieve what neither could accomplish alone. And in classrooms and cockpits across the globe, a new generation of pilots was learning that precision was not the enemy of passion, that calculation could enhance rather than replace instinct, and that sometimes the quietest voice in the room had the most important thing to say. Rachel closed her notebook and looked out at the stars beginning to appear in the desert sky. Tomorrow would bring new students, new challenges, and new opportunities to prove that excellence could take as many forms as there were people willing to pursue it. Her call sign Sunday would endure, not as a limitation or a joke, but as a testament to the power of precision, the value of preparation, and the quiet courage required to trust in your own unique approach to greatness. This story is a reminder that strength doesn't always announce itself with noise, and innovation doesn't always come from the expected places. Sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply being excellent at what you do, especially when others don't yet understand the value of your approach. Excellence speaks in many languages, but it always speaks with authenticity, precision, and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your worth. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and become a part of our Everyday Life Stories community. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment below. We love hearing from our amazing viewers around the world.